What is up, guys? This is Gabriel Fairman, and today we'll be talking about generative AI and translations. So generative AI is a new breakthrough technology that's been available to the wide public for basically a year now, a little bit over, since GPT 3.5 ChatGPT came out. And generative AI is very different than other kinds of technology out there because it has the ability to emulate semantic understanding. So by this, I mean it's able to emulate the understanding of meaning, right? Semantics is another fancy word for meaning. So with previous tech, it worked basically on a syntactical basis and statistical basis, trying to understand the similarities and differences between certain words and word structures and sentences and so on when it comes to translation. Generative AI is able to use machine learning and mainly transformer models to really leverage a much higher level of mathematics in order to emulate the idea of meaning, right? And I'm not going to get too deep into the machine learning components. I really want to focus today on how it reshapes, let's say, the idea of translation. So talking a little bit about the translation technology stack that most of us have been working on for the past maybe 40 years or so. So our translation tech stack is really based on text and knowledge bases. I would summarize it as that. So you have text, it gets ingested by a translation management system, or what people call a CAT tool, some kind of translation tool. It gets ingested, it gets parsed, and it gets populated into translation-friendly environment. This translation-friendly environment interacts with knowledge bases that has typically two different kinds of corpus. One is a translation memory, which is a sentence corpus, and the other is a terminology or glossary, which is a terminological corpus, right? As the translators go through text, these engines, these tools, they look for similarities and differences in these different corpus. But these similarities and differences are basically leveraged syntactically only. By this, I mean, let's say you have a sentence that says, John has gone to the store, and now you have another, and you translate that. That gets stored in the translation memory. Now you get the sentence, John went to the store. That's a very similar syntactically speaking sentence. So it's going to pick up some kind of match, and that match is going to be described as a fuzzy. The translator is then going to have to upgrade that or carry over the differences so that that sentence now matches the new context, right? That's been the case for many, many years. Same thing with glossaries. If you're translating and you identify that market is a key term and that market has to be translated in a given way in a given language, the translation tool is going to remind you of that, right? And that's been huge. It was a huge breakthrough. I mean, just imagine translating thousands of pages of user documentation, products in the early stages of globalization without such technology. Versioning control, leveraging past translations, those were all insurmountable problems that really hindered the ability of a company to scale when it came to translations, right? So translation memories and glossaries, they were very, very powerful tools. They enabled people to standardize terminology. They enabled people to take care of their brand, how their brand communicated to their consumers. These were very, very powerful tools. The challenge with these tools is that they are not context sensitive. So they're not really ever understanding what's going on as far as semantics goes. They're really just understanding the syntax. So again, going back to our example, let's say you have the sentence, John has gone to the store. And now you have another sentence that says, John went to the market. Those sentences from a semantic perspective, they're proposing the same idea of meaning, right? John, there's a subject, John, who has gone somewhere and in the past, which is very similar, and the place is a store or market, which is a very similar kind of place. Now, in a previous syntactical kind of environment, those differences wouldn't be able to be reconciled because there are far too many. But as in a semantic environment, a large language model is able to understand that these sentences are in fact very similar, even though they're different from a syntactical perspective. Now, that enables a whole different kind of understanding of what a technological translation tool can do for you. So again, looking at these examples, right? Let's say in this past paradigm, in the syntactical paradigm, let's say you have the sentence, John has gone to the market, but you have in your glossary, you have the idea that market should be translated as store, but in your translation memory, you have market reading as grocery. And when it comes to translating, the translator would have been left with a linguistic conflict to resolve. Should I prioritize the translation memory? Should I prioritize the glossary? Then translators would have to perform even further searches. I'm going to have to search now what they call a concordance search. I'm going to have to search across the entire knowledge base to see how this has been used in the past in other contexts. And there's this tremendous level of linguistic grunt work that's necessary just to research the context and make sure that people are leveraging the standards that they're supposed to be leveraging so that they stay on brand, so that they stay on context. But the challenge is that this is very time consuming. And not only that, but it really pushes the human cognitive capabilities to the limit. There's only so much information that we can process at a given point in time. That's particularly what large language models are really, really good at. They can crunch a huge amount of data in a very short amount of time. They're basically, in a way, compressing data, if you really think about it from a more abstract perspective. So a large language model can come in and very quickly go through these differences in discourse, what's in the translation memory, what's in the glossary, and resolve those differences and say, for instance, in that given example, in this given example, it's more relevant to use grocery than store, or it's more relevant to use market than supermarket, and so on. It can make these decisions. And in our vision, at least, you still need a human to supervise these decisions and ultimately arbitrate between what's right and what's wrong, what makes sense in any given context. But all of that grunt work has been done for them. So the large language model, it does a much more contextually aware or contextually sensitive processing of information, very different from the translation memory and the translation and the glossary, which are basically operating at a purely syntactical perspective. So for now, we've covered our bases, right? We're working in this previously a syntactical paradigm. Now we're moving into a semantic paradigm. And the beauty of it is that the semantic paradigm is a lot more sensitive, a lot more malleable according to context than that previous segment that was a lot, paradigm that was a lot harder, right? That brings a huge amount of benefits when it comes to productivity, when it comes to elevating the translator into a much more cognitively sophisticated position when it comes to text, right? As the grunt work gets done, there's the possibility to take care of a lot more higher level editorial work than any time in the past. So that's, in my opinion, in a nutshell, the initial impact that a large language model can have when it comes to translation. But the challenge is that a lot of people are using large language models in a very different way, right? The first main way that we see people using large language models is that they propose it, even implicitly, as an alternative to human translation. So there's always these questions, right? Is a large language model reliable? Is it better than the human? And in my opinion, that's a very misconstrued kind of proposition. Sure, you can go that path, and you're very likely to be able to disqualify a large language model as hallucinating or as inconsistent, as this and that. But to me, that really misses out on the magic that a large language model is able to bring into the translation and localization technology table, which is the ability to interact in a very different and much richer capability with the translator. So going back to that proposition, I really don't enjoy the idea of comparing a human to a large language model. In my opinion, a human is infinitely more creative, more sophisticated, more sensitive aware, but we do have our limitations when it comes to crunching large amounts of data at any given time. In that given respect, even though the answers may vary, typically a large language model is going to outperform us when it comes to just evaluating a very wide amount of data in a very limited amount of time. So the second scenario where we see people using large language models is as some form of machine translation enricher. So for instance, you get a machine translation, you send it to a large language model, and it can enrich that. And that is a powerful proposition as well. Typically, large language models can add value when it comes to a machine translation. They're a little bit more sensitive to context, and the result is very powerful. But again, something that we have to keep in mind is that the computational cost for large language models is much higher than it is for machine translation models. So you have to be very careful when you do that. And when you do that, then you run into the question of how are you going to leverage context? Are you going to train the model? Are you going to work with zero-shot learning, with few-shot learning? And you start to begin to open the door into machine learning and natural language processing problems, which can become exponentially sophisticated as you dive into that rabbit hole. Now, the third model, and this is the model where we believe our future resides more in, is this crossroads between machine translation, large language models, and humans. And this seamless kind of collaboration that's dialogical at every given step. So if you take a look at a tool like VWX, what we're trying to do is create a situation where the feeds that are being proposed to the translator are taking into account dynamically a much wider amount of content and context than was previously possible in the past with the syntactical paradigm. It's learning from the translators as they move along, as they commit to their choices. This model is dynamically learning in runtime, so it's adapting kind of seamlessly. So if you become more informal in your choices, it's going to suggest less formal choices, and vice versa. If you become more formal in your choices, it's going to suggest more formal choices. And most importantly, it's also going to flag potential issues to the translator, who is the ultimate judge, the ultimate arbitrator of what works and doesn't work. And in this context, the way we see it, the translator gets upgraded from just translating words to the position of what we call a language flow architect, where they are now at the frontier, at the edge between a large language model and machine translations, like the overall linguistic corpus, and the text. They are the ones who are arbitrating between this. So every time they translate something, they're not just translating a sentence, they're actually training the model. And in that regard, one can claim that it's much higher value, much more higher added value work than just translating sentences. The challenge about that is that the work becomes a lot more editorial and a lot less about, for instance, typing speed or just grunt productivity. The choices, they carry far greater ramifications. This means that in many regards, the bar for what it means to be a good translator gets higher and higher. And that is a trend I do believe to be true due to large language models. And I think it applies in general to writing. I mean, if you ask a large language model to write an essay, it's going to be able to produce a fairly cogent essay in most given subjects, at least based on what I've seen. But when it comes to my writing, for instance, I've really realized very soon that the uniqueness of my voice is what differentiates me from a large language model. And the uniqueness of my voice comes from my editorial style, comes from my vision of what the world is, the vision of who I am. And that's something that's fairly unique to me. And the more, the better I am at, the more I can be unique about it, right? And the large language model, in my opinion, sure, you can get to pretty sophisticated results through prompt engineering and iterations and things like that. But as a basic comparison, I think that I can be more sophisticated than the large language model, but it does require a more higher intellectual faculty than I would use if I'm just like processing words, right? So that, to me, is very indicative of what the future state of translations look like through large language models. Now, when it comes to the immediate impact, what do we see the most? We see a lot of mystery, a lot of resistance, a lot of fear. Is this safe? Will they take my job? So there's a lot of emotional resistance and a lot of negativity, typically, around these large language models, or it's the opposite, a lot of excitement from a minority of people. We do see a lot of early adopters benefiting immensely from this tech. So we're seeing people being able to translate twice as fast, with less errors, even better ease of mind, better overall well-being. And it's a beautiful thing, right? If you're able to do twice as much, you can earn twice as much. But there is, again, a lot of resistance because we're talking about changing the way people have learned to work over decades. This isn't something easy to do. And this really touches on what I believe to be the core question around generative AI, which is authorship, right? When you're working with a large language model and producing a text, it really begs the question, is this text mine after all, or is it now the large language models? How much do I have to change in any given sentence to consider that the text is mine and not the large language models? So this is a very curious thing. Like, for instance, in the past, right, if I was actually typing out word for word the sentence, I could really feel that the text was mine. But with translation memory, for instance, that began to be jeopardized in certain cases. But for the most part, words were still being typed, fuzzies were still being upgraded into perfect matches and so on. So the authorship wasn't really being questioned. But now you're getting into situations where maybe you're going to just confirm 80% of the sentences that are being offered to you. Are you still the author just by confirming these sentences? Do you have to implement changes to make them better even if they don't need them in order for you to be the author? So where is the authorship, where does the authorship fall apart, right? In my opinion, as a translator, I love it. I mean, I don't really feel my authorship is being put in doubt in any moment. I feel much like when I cook. Sometimes, it's just about adding the right amount of salt or the right amount of pepper to make that plate great, and not about like overdoing it with tons of seasonings and tons of different processes to make food great. I personally love simple food, and I believe simple food is actually really, really hard to make, at least extremely well. And I think the same goes to translations. I think that producing very high quality translations doesn't necessarily require always a tremendous amount of changes to what's coming out from a large language model, but it does require knowing exactly where these changes must belong. And that opens the door to a whole range of questions, which is, how do we measure this effort, right? In the past, translations have been basically billed for and paid for by word count, some version of word count. And now we're reaching a point in our juncture of technological development where words don't mean very much anymore. What really means something is cognitive effort. And it's hard to gauge cognitive effort because while you could ostensibly claim that cognitive effort is a matter of hours used or a matter of the number of edits introduced, it goes much deeper than that, because some people can be much more productive than others. Some people can be much less productive than others. Some people can make fewer changes, but the right changes. Some people can change a lot, but not necessarily make the text better. So these are questions that I believe need to be answered over the next months, years, definitely, in order to make sure that we create and foster an environment that's sustainable for most translators and companies out there. Now, that being said, I think, and I heard this earlier this week, if generative AI is a threat to translators and to agencies and translation buyers. And my response was, it's definitely a threat if you want things to continue the same. If your focus is on status quo, generative AI is a threat to status quo. Now, if it's a threat in the greater sense of the threat, does it pose, let's say, for instance, a financial threat to the earnings of a given translator, of a given agency, or a given translation buyer? That, in my opinion, is really up to each and every one of us as far as how we choose to implement, how we choose to adopt, and or how we choose to resist this technology. Because the fact is that it's here to stay. It makes us much more productive than we could have ever been before, and it does require a fair amount of adaptation and tweaking on our end in order to really harness the best of it. So, in my opinion, we're really at a critical juncture when it comes to generative AI in our field, and I really hope that through dialogue and through more awareness, people begin to really dive head into this. As opposed to waiting for the change to happen to that. And the reason for that is because, just as an example, right? If I'm a translator and I'm using this tool for myself, that means I'm going to be more productive, that means I'm going to make more money, and that means I'm on top of the curve as far as leading and cutting edge principles. Now, if I'm not using this, if I'm sticking to my old habits, I'm likely to see over time a decrease in work coming my way because my rates may become non-competitive, or because my productivity may be non-compliant with what people are looking for, and I'm going to essentially be waiting for the day and time where I'm no longer competitive. Then I'm going to be forced to change, and I'm likely going to be forced to change in the paradigm of somebody else, which means that instead of being rewarded for my extra productivity, I'm likely to be penalized for the fact that the technology is doing a lot of work for me. So it's very, very curious that the same tech can be both an opportunity and a threat when it comes to income generation for all different parties involved in our industry. So this is a very interesting time, and it really requires a lot more dialogue, a lot more constructive criticism, and really coming together as a community to figure a lot of these hard problems out. So that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. Till next time. Bye-bye.